After the success of the Atari 2600, the failure of the 5200, the failure of the 7800, and the failure of the Lynx, Atari thought that maybe the Jaguar was going to bring them back into prominence. Well, as we all know, the Jaguar also failed to really light a fire under consumers, and it would be added to the graveyard of Atari systems that just didn't bring the company back into the limelight like it wanted to be. So let's discuss some reasons why the Jaguar was not the world-beating video game system, starting with the confusing hardware. Now, the Atari Jaguar had 5 processors in a slightly confusing design for most developers at the time. That, coupled with what I understand is the lack of really high quality development tools, made it extremely challenging for developers to create good games for the system. So what they ended up doing was falling back on the familiar 68000 processor, where they could easily port Amiga titles to the system. Games like Cannon Fodder and Syndicate and Theme Park really didn't do a lot to make the system look appealing.
Yes, mission complete.
Now, there's a famous quote from John Carmack who says had Atari included a little bit more hardware, they might have been able to put up a reasonable fight against Sony. And to me, that really blows my mind that such a small company like Atari and the developer Flare would be able to create a system that could compete with the big juggernaut that is Sony. They almost did it, but not quite. Also, the choice of using cartridges instead of CDs with the system, I think that might have hurt it just a little bit, because the cost of manufacturing cartridges is much higher than the cost of manufacturing CDs. Plus, it would have made the Jaguar look just a little bit more next-gen than the 16-bit systems. I mean, 3DO was fully CD, why couldn't the Jaguar be? Another issue that's brought up pretty regularly is the design of the system. Now, I feel that the console itself is amazing. It looks beautiful. I always remember the description in a video game magazine that compared it to the Batmobile. However, the controller may be the biggest design misstep on this whole system. Why they decided to include a keypad, I'm not really sure. I think maybe they were jealous of the ColecoVision or the Intellivision's gamepad. I think it might have been better if they had gone with something more like the Sega Genesis 6-button controller. Just looking at the controller, it looks awkward and uncomfortable. However, it is actually quite comfortable. Another awkward design is the look of the CD unit, which was often compared to a toilet, so that did not help things much at all. Now let's talk about the game library. The Jaguar's library of games was not all that great. As I said before, a lot of developers just fell back on the 68000 and just ported their games from Amiga and Atari ST and other systems. There was a few standout titles like Tempest 2000, Alien vs. Predator, Iron Soldier, Rayman, Doom, Missile Command 3D, and games like that, but when you're trying to compete with the big boys like Sega and Nintendo, you have to have more than 5 or 6 compelling titles in your game library.
Nothing can stop me now!
Now, I've always wondered, why did the Atari 2600 succeed where the Jaguar failed? Well, you have to consider that at the time there weren't a lot of other companies out there creating video game consoles. And before the game Space Invaders was released for the 2600, it really wasn't all that successful either. It was that killer app that really drove sales for the 2600 system. And unfortunately for the Jaguar, it just never achieved that same killer app. I suppose you could call Tempest 2000 and Alien vs. Predator the killer apps for the system, but they just don't have the wide appeal of a game such as Wii Bowling, for example. So essentially, the weak game library for the Jaguar was not as appealing as the libraries for the Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, or even the upcoming Sony PlayStation, which again had the budget to create such huge and appealing games. Not to mention the fact that Sony also had really good development tools and were very supportive of their developers. So naturally, games were just going to be better on that system. Next, let's talk about the marketing. Now, it's pretty well known that Jack Tramiel was not really big on marketing his products. The Jaguar got a few really strange advertisements on TV, so Atari didn't do a whole heck of a lot in the television marketing department. Now, the most famous marketing angle from Atari was that the Jaguar was a 64-bit system, and in a way, I blame Sega for this line of thinking. You see, it was Sega who really pushed the fact that the Genesis was a 16-bit system, when the original Nintendo Entertainment System was only an 8-bit system.
16-bit arcade hits.
So Atari just decided to run with this, thinking that it would be an easy way for consumers to understand the differences in power of the two systems. Of course, we all know that didn't really work out. And the 64-bit claim ended up being an albatross around the neck of the Jaguar's legacy. Because how could the Jaguar be a 64-bit system when it only looks slightly better than a 16-bit system? And to that, I would point you to games such as Cybermorph, Iron Soldier, Missile Command 3D, iWar, 05, and other 3D-based games. Now, there were quite a few magazine advertisements from Atari themselves, but none of the other publishers were creating ads for their games on the Jaguar. At best, you might see an ad that said there was a Jaguar version available, but nothing dedicated just to the Jaguar itself. And then, of course, let's not forget the infamous Cave commercial, which was extremely cheesy and low budget, and was mostly meant to blow out some of the remaining stock of the system.
Had enough yet?
So essentially, Atari really didn't know how to market this system properly.
What's the use of even trying? You can't get a break.
So the competition for the Jaguar was extremely high. It was of course dominated by the 16-bit consoles of the Super Nintendo and Genesis, so gamers were already very familiar with these systems. They had already built up a huge library of games, so for Atari to try to carve out a piece of the pie was going to be very, very difficult, especially considering the fact that Atari had not really done much in the way of video games for about a decade, and had been mostly concerned with their 16-bit Atari ST computer line. So for Atari to jump back into the gaming sphere after ceding it to other companies like Nintendo and Sega was going to be very challenging for them. And most kids of the time didn't know anything about Atari or even cared. The only people that did care were their parents. This leads into Atari's waning reputation. Now, of course, Atari was not the industry giant that they used to be, and the crash of 1983 really left a bad taste in most consumers' mouths. And of course, they're going to blame Atari for that, even though really it was just a lack of quality games on the market. And you know, failures like the 7800 and the Lynx and the 5200 really didn't build much confidence with consumers. They could only live off the success of the 2600 for so long. And because consumers weren't really trustful of Atari, retailers were not very eager to stock Atari Jaguar products. And as you can imagine, you can't make sales if you can't get that product to the consumer. Atari was also in the midst of huge financial struggles. Atari just did not have the financial resources to market and development video games for this system, especially when other companies like Sega, Sony, and Nintendo just had apparently bottomless amounts of cash in order to promote their systems. I do remember back in the day that Atari was so excited that they were able to, I guess, basically sue Sega. There was supposed to be some crossover games from Sega to appear on Atari systems. Could you imagine seeing virtual racing on the Jaguar? I think that might have been a little bit better than Checkered Flag. And to dovetail with the financial problems that Atari was having, I understand they also withheld a lot of payments to developers, and one of the biggest examples of this was Fight for Life, because the game that we ended up getting was not the final game. You know, if you make promises to your developers, I think you should keep them. That did not really help Atari's reputation very much either, did it? And lastly, we have the issue of timing. Now, the Jaguar launched at a transitional moment in the gaming industry. It was more or less wedged between the 16-bit Sega and Nintendo systems and the upcoming Sony and 3DO and Saturn systems.
Yes.
The Jaguar was more meant to compete with the 16-bit systems and included a little bit of 3D hardware, but it was not primarily built to be a 3D machine. So basically what I'm saying is, the Jaguar didn't know what it wanted to be, a 2D system or a 3D system. Perhaps if Atari knew what this system was all about, they could have focused on those style of games. So is there anything that Atari could have done to make the Jaguar a successful system? Honestly, I'm not really sure that there is. The biggest problem is that the system did not have a significant number of really great games that would attract consumers. But what they could have done is built on a small level of success for the next game system. And then perhaps that system could have been just a little bit more successful than the Jaguar. And then the system after that could have been just a little bit more successful than the successor to the Jaguar.
In the words of my generation, up yours!
Essentially what I'm saying is that for Atari to have really made a successful re-entry into the video game market, they needed to take baby steps, and not just go for broke like they did with the Jaguar. Now, while the Atari Jaguar may have failed to bring Atari back into prominence, it certainly succeeded in sparking the imaginations of Atari fans everywhere. There's new homebrew games coming out for the system, as well as ports of Atari ST games, and it just amazes me that 30 years later, we are still talking about the Atari Jaguar. Thank you all for watching, take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye, everyone.
Yeah! You like this? Oh, wait, come here. Stop sliding, stop getting away. Here you go.